Whenever you're learning a skill, whether it's playing an instrument or a particular skill at work, it takes some time. It takes some repetition to learn the mechanics and the motor skills you need, both from your mind all the way through your body to perform that well. In fact, there's a whole science developing the study of sports mechanics. And sports is such a huge industry that physicians, doctors, researchers are studying how athletes can best perform. And as they've studied sports mechanics, what they've discovered is that there are certain sports that are really helpful or easy, conducive for muscle memory. The mechanics of the sport can be repeated again and again and again in a controlled environment in order to quickly correct errors and to develop patterns in your muscles and in your mind for exactly what to do. Some sports are easier for this. For example, the sport of golf. Now, that doesn't mean that golf is an easy sport. In fact, it's meant to be very difficult. You've got a tiny ball and a tiny hole and a long distance to go. So that difficulty, though, is balanced by the fact that it's an easier sport to practice. What do you mean by that? You can go to the driving range and go with your golf coach or your technician, and you can hit ball after ball after ball after ball right away in a row to develop that muscle memory. You might think of a pitcher on the pitcher's mound or a gymnast on the balance beam. The environment doesn't change too much. So these things, though difficult sports, are easier to practice and develop muscle memory. Other sports are much more cloudy on their journey to muscle memory. One of my favorite sports, is surfing. Surfing is a sport with a very long learning curve. It takes a long time. Why? Because you can't practice the particular necessary maneuvers over and over and over again because the conditions of the ocean are always changing. The time on a wave is very short, and you never know what you're going to get when you go out to that practice session. It's never the same. Some days you might have good practice conditions. Other days it's very difficult. Very difficult. The sport I want to leave you with that's probably good at balancing both of these worlds, controlled conditions and uncontrolled, repetitive practice and chaos, is, of course, football. Football. Take, for example, the quarterback. It's considered the most difficult athletic position in all of sports anywhere. You see, as a quarterback, he might learn to throw a spiral in a short amount of time as a young boy. Even in a couple days, just repetitively throwing with dad out in the yard, he can get a spiral down and learn the mechanics of throwing very quickly. For a quarterback, it will take a lifetime of learning to navigate the chaos of the pocket and of the line that is trying to throw him to the ground and collapse in around him. It will take a lifetime of learning to keep your eyes downfield and progress through your reads in the midst of uncontrollable environments all around him at game time. Learning to feel the pressure of a defense is not something that can be stimulated easily in practice. And so quarterbacks often mature in their sport late into their 30s. Now, Pastor, why would you start with this illustration of things you can learn quickly and things that take a lifetime to learn? Because discipleship is kind of like that. It has this balance in it. There are some habits you can repeat in your discipleship that are absolutely foundational, like throwing a spiral, learning to throw the ball downfield. Habits like Bible reading and prayer, Sunday attendance and worship together, giving and serving one another in the body of Christ. These kinds of habits are habits that ought to be in your repertoire and practiced again and again and again because they're the foundation for everything else. And yet, our discipleship is practiced the game time comes. And it takes a long time to learn how to be Christ-like when the defense is coming against us and there's chaos around us in an ever-changing and unpredictable environment, like our relationships, like our workplaces, like raising children, like trials and tests in our health and body and mental well-being, like our marriages. Wow, Christ-like can be very hard to learn. Because these storms, these situations, they just come up at us out of nowhere. And it takes a lifetime of learning how to recognize what's going on and keeping our eyes on Jesus. And so it may be, listen carefully, it may be that it can take years to unlearn old things and relearn new things in our life, new ways of habits. You see that quarterback, when that pocket is collapsing, immediately they go to all their worst habits and mistakes. And it can take years for us to unlearn and relearn. And Christ-likeness is difficult for this reason as well, that our human nature is with us and ever present, and so deeply ingrained in us, in our responses, in our attitudes, in the heat of the moment, and the things that come out of our mouth. Wow! Takes a while, doesn't it? How long do we struggle with worldly ways of communication and frustration and selfishness and failure? The prophet Isaiah, when he's in the presence of God, he says, "Woe to me, woe to me. Who will save me? Who will help me?" It can be a long process to learn and relearn our discipleship and following him. Something similar is happening to the disciples in the book of Mark that we've been studying. We've seen their ups and downs. We've seen their learning and their relearning. We've seen the need for repetition in their own life, because as each situation changes, maybe there's a healing and they fail. Maybe there's a young boy amongst their midst and Jesus is teaching and they fail to understand. Maybe there's a confession of that you're the Christ, and yet they fail to get what that means. And all these different situations are coming at them. We've seen them struggle with their humanity and their own expectations. And so what is Mark doing? He is walking them through and walking us through the repetition of the kingdom values that he wants us to know. Why? Because our humanity is so deep within us. I want you to take a peek at the structure of this section, and I'm just going to pause to teach you a little bit where we're at. We're going to show you this chart, this outline, because I want you to understand, again today, you're going to be thinking, Pastor, you've already preached on verses like this. Like, we've already covered this ground. Yes, we have. And with Mark, we're going to cover it again today. Why? Because Mark understands the depth of our humanity and the difficulty of discipleship and the world around us, and how we've got to keep relearning kingdom values in every situation. What do you mean, Pastor Chad? This section of Mark, I want you to see, it begins with the healing of a blind man, and it ends with the healing of a blind man. After this point right here, in our series in the spring, is all in Jerusalem. It's all heading to the cross. It's the last week of Jesus' life. So this lesson today, here, today, and next week, we are really turning a point. Mark wants us to get it one more time. Wants us to get it. And what do you have in this section of Mark? You have 3 careful predictions of the death of Christ. Each one of those is followed by a reteaching of kingdom values. And all that we've seen in between these things are the disciples and miracles and teaching, conversation, failures, illustrations, examples. The child among them is an example of the healing of the deaf mute is an example. The disciples are in constant discussion, and we get those stories scattered within this structure right here. So Mark is going to repeat. Why? Because we need it. And yet in this last section, Mark has saved a few special nuggets for us, a few things we haven't learned yet. He is built. It's almost like he's building. We've learned that Jesus is going to die, that he's going to die, but we still have some questions here before his journey to the cross of why? What is going on? And the disciples still have struggles. So if you're following along in your bulletin, you see I've set this up around some of these questions, and our big idea is going to come at the very end of today's message. And my goal today is to one more time build the tension, to build the difficulty up until we see the answer that Mark gives us. Mark chapter 10 and verse 32. All right, are you with? Somebody give me a nod or a wave out there. You with me? Okay. Mark chapter 10, verse 32. They were on their way up to Jerusalem. We've discussed this already. This section of Mark is what it looks like to journey with Jesus, to be on the way of discipleship. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way. And the disciples were amazed, or sometimes it's translated astonished here, but it's the same word as last week's word when they're amazed that Jesus is teaching, like we just can't believe this. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. In the crowd following Jesus, there is a note of fear and amazement. And so right away in this final section of Mark's repetition, there's a tension. Why? They're headed to Jerusalem. And you've got Jesus and his leading the way and kingdom values on one side, and right on the other side, you've got worldly values, fear, you've got tension, human perspective with the disciples. Maybe you've felt that way on your own journey before. Jesus, I know I'm supposed to follow you, but I'm afraid as to where we're going and what it's going to be like when we get there. And I want you to sense this tension throughout these passages today. There's unresolved issues. There's unresolved emotions. There's unresolved understanding. And all of this is building to Mark's point and Mark's big idea and his resolution. Mark in this passage has given us another sandwich. Remember, how many of you remember we learned about the Markan sandwich, right? He likes to put things in between, in the middle. And this is another example of that. We're going to get Jesus commenting, then we're going to get a story about disciples, then we're going to get Jesus teaching. And it's all meant to be eaten or taken in together at the same time. So we'll look at these ideas once more this week. Number one, what do we learn from this week's passage? We learn that Jesus is the servant destined for suffering. He is the servant destined for suffering. Mark chapter 10 and verse 33. Again, Jesus took the 12 aside. Notice, there's fear there. So how does he respond? Come, let me teach you. Come, let me disciple you. Again, he took the 12 aside and he told them what was going to happen to him, preparing them. Verse 33, he tells them, we're going up to Jerusalem, he said. And the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and they will condemn him to death. And they will hand him over to Gentiles. So twice he's going to be handed over. The Son of Man will be handed over to chief priests, and then the chief priests are going to hand him over to Gentiles. Who's in charge here? Why does Jesus keep getting delivered up and handed over? What's going on? They will condemn him to death and hand him over to Gentiles, verse 34, who will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and then the repetition, kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise. Now, we the readers, you guys are great. You've been studying all this semester, all this fall with me. We know why Jesus is going to Jerusalem. We know where he's going. We know why he's going. We know what's going to happen. But for a minute, for just a quick minute, I want you to put yourself in the disciples' shoes. We know the cross is coming. The disciples don't know that yet. All they know is that there's going to be a death. And up to this point, Mark has not really mentioned Jerusalem too often. So they're learning something new. Oh, wow, we're going to Jerusalem. Oh, wow, Son of Man. He calls himself the Son of Man again. And if we put ourselves in the disciples' shoes, their minds are racing with what Jerusalem is. It's the holy city. It's the place of power and authority. It's the place of Israel's kings and rule. It's where God rules from his temple over all things. It is the place, right? They hear the word Son of Man. And they're thinking about this perhaps they're thinking about this holy figure who was anointed, messianic, powerful, at the right hand of God, at the throne of God, in the presence of God. And so the disciples, they've heard about Jesus' death. Yeah. But man, they're getting excited still. Woo! Jerusalem is coming. Jesus is coming. He's the Messiah. And somehow in their hearts and in their minds, they're missing what his death was all about. What his death is all about. Mark doesn't want us to miss it. And you'll see in a minute why they're missing it. Don't worry, they're missing it. Mark doesn't want us to miss the death of Christ. And so for the first time, he's told us about Jerusalem. And for the first time, this phrase, Son of Man, it begins to jump out with some special force as a symbolic title. And yet Jesus' words, while having all of this symbolism of power and greatness and the throne of God, Jesus pushes the disciples in a different direction. And he gives a description of his fate. Look at the language carefully. Death, handed over, mocked, spit, flogged. These descriptions are pointers to someone particular, another known figure besides the Son of Man title. Another, who are these clues pointing us to? They're pointing us to a figure known as the servant. The servant. Isaiah, in his book, he is working with God's prophecy and talking about what is to come. And there's a section in his book called the Servant Songs. And they're all about this figure who suffers and is abused for Israel's good. Maybe Isaiah is reflecting on his own life. Maybe he's thinking of Israel. But we know that the gospel writers, when they learned about this servant, they realized, oh, this is Jesus. What do you mean, Pastor Chad? Look at Isaiah in verse 50. All of this language comes from the book of Isaiah. Verse 50, Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6. Isaiah, in the servant songs describing the servant, says, I offered my back to those who beat me. Flogging, something like flogging. My cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. Those are the same words that Mark uses. Because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore, this servant, he says, I have set my face like a flint, and I know I will not be put to shame. You need to see what Mark wants all disciples to see, that Jesus is the servant destined for suffering. Why? Because when we follow him on the way and we learn our own suffering, our own faiths, our own trauma, our own trials, our own tests, and God is using those to disciple us, we need to be anchored in the God who had a plan from the days of Isaiah all the way through to the moment Jesus walked this earth, a plan to send a chosen servant who would be glorious and highly exalted, and yet the way he would show that was by giving himself up to others. And so I pause to show you that, to see the moments of fulfillment and faithfulness as we sang about in Scripture. Why? Because it shows us that God is in control. It shows us that when we want high status and glory and the splendor and the lights and the glitz and the glamour of Jerusalem in our own lives, and yet sometimes we get the hurt and the brutality and the violence and the horror of humanity. And when we experience that injustice, We know that we are not alone because he suffered for us. God was in control. God was using the evil against Jesus for our good. And so when you suffer, you need to know you're not alone. When you walk on the way of discipleship, and when your face is set like a flint. This was a prayer my mom used to pray when I was young. She would pray over us kids. She would pray over the family. Lord, let their face be what's set like a flint, like a stone, determined, fixed, forward, and let them not veer to the right or to the left. Be purposeful about the things of the Lord. Jesus had that stone-like purpose, going to his death. When we walk in discipleship, there's a promise for us. When we follow him, we will not be put to shame. We will not be put to shame. So, in this first part of the sandwich here, we've learned something. We've learned who Jesus represents. He represents the servant of Isaiah. He is fulfilling the prophecies of old, the promised figure from that wonderful book of Isaiah. We've learned that he's, yes, the Son of Man, full of glory. Yes, he's going to be in charge of Jerusalem. Yes, he is over Jerusalem, but he's a suffering servant who will be given over. We know where he's going. We know who he is. But Mark has still not revealed why. We do. We know why. It's in all of our sermons. Mark has not revealed why. And so there's a mystery here. With the absence of this answer, the disciples, listen carefully, they're thinking, okay, maybe something bad is going to happen. We're a little bit worried. But Jerusalem, wow. The Son of Man, wow. He fed the 5,000, the 4,000. He's healed, raised the dead. Wow. Okay, so maybe there's a little speed bump on the way there. But we know the power and the good stuff and the political might. We know it's coming. Greater things, bigger things. Yeah, Jesus. Okay, it might be some hard times, but yeah, we're going to do it. How do you know that's what they're thinking, Pastor Chad? Number 2, because disciples continue to struggle with ambitions for royal glory. That's a mouthful. The disciples are still struggling with their humanity and their discipleship. It's a long process, isn't it? We've seen so far in their discipleship, these guys have struggled with prayer, with faith, with unbelief, with status, with obedience, with listening, with perceiving who Christ is. And now one more time, we get a sense of their utter dullness and slowness. The pocket is collapsing, and all of their old habits are coming back. An interception's getting ready to occur. Mark chapter 10, verse 35. James and John, sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Woo. That one line we could preach a sermon on. You know that, right? And how we pray? Oh, yeah. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Verse 36, what do you want me to do for you? Jesus said. And they replied, let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left hand in your glory. In your glory. Jesus has been talking about his own death. They're wrestling with amazement and fear. The disciples have had a brutal run at being slow to learn. He is telling them one more time, I'm going to die and suffer. This is what glory looks like, and they still have the wrong picture of glory. He has just got done describing his torture. And they are thinking about misguided worldly values. They conceive of hope in Jesus, the Messiah, as political power, political glory, earthly glory. And James and John, they didn't want to miss their opportunity. If we're going to Jerusalem, They didn't want to miss their opportunity to rule at his right and left, the two places of honor by the throne, to be the ones in charge, to have the kingly connections, to be sovereign, to rise to the top. We've been at the bottom long enough, Jesus. We're ready to rule. Even as Jesus was lowering himself to the bottom. They're struggling with the human condition. What do you mean, Pastor Cheb? I'm reminded of the story of a guy named Joshua A. Norton. Joshua A. Norton arrived in San Francisco during the gold rush in 1949 with a vision of wealth and success and power. He started out pretty good on that vision. He was a financier and a real estate speculator, and he took risks to make money. Unfortunately, in a risk speculating on rice had gone up in value because there was a famine in China, and so the cost of rice had shot through the roof. He decided to use all of his money to buy an entire shipload of rice from Peru, thinking that the value would remain high. So he bought at a price thinking he could still sell high. Only a week later, the price of rice dramatically dropped under what he had paid, and he lost everything, speculating on the value of rice. He put a lawsuit out there with the company. He lost the lawsuit over his contract, trying to get out of all that he owed. He thought, well, the next solution is I've got to be powerful to change this. I'm going to get myself out of this, so he ran for Congress, only he was unsuccessful as well, running for Congress. And rather than admitting defeat, Norton attempted one more approach to achieve greatness, the self-greatness or the self-made man, the self-proclamation. In 1859, he declared himself Norton the First, Emperor of the United States. And he began to declare this all over San Francisco, that he was the emperor of the entire country. Now, he had no formal power, so people laughed about this. But he began to do this day after day, declaring himself in charge, making grandiose claims. He would issue proclamations. He would hold court in the streets for all who wanted to have their cases settled. He would go and inspect the conditions of the buildings and the cities and the parks and make rulings about what should be done. Now, the people of San Francisco, over time, they took his antics as a humorous spectacle, and they played along with him. That sounds like San Fran, doesn't it? Norton became a beloved, eccentric character known for his comical ambitions. He made over 400 proclamations and rules for government, and the newspaper would print them and say, here's Emperor Norton has proclaimed this week, and everybody would read it and get a kick out of it. He started to get favors from people. He received perks from the city, free rent, free meals, ferries across the river, souvenirs. People would come to see this Norton, Emperor of the United States, and he became a tourist attraction. He issued decrees ranging from Congress to construction, and it was all make-believe. When he died, thousands attended his funeral, and he became the basis for several characters in literature, including by Mark Twain and Robert Louis Stevenson. Here's the lesson of Norton, Emperor of the United States. Even when people find themselves at their lowest point, they still struggle with human ambitions to rule ourselves and others. Whether it's over other people or our own destiny, with sin. Listen, our freedom and our ambitions are no longer God-directed. They are self-directed and self-centered. And even those kinds of wrongly placed desires to rule and be over others can infiltrate the discipling community and the disciples. So James and John say, yeah, you're going to your death. We don't quite get that, but can we rule when you get there? On your right and on your left? Can we be in charge? Listen, even disciples today jockey for positions with ambitions of status and rule in the local church or small group or friend relationships. Who's the most spiritual? Who's in charge? Even as we walk the journey together. Now, Jesus doesn't wholly affirm their rule. He continues in verse 38. Mysterious statements he makes. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I drink, which is the cup of God's wrath and penalty? Or be baptized with the baptism I'm going to be baptized with, probably referring to his death again. Remember, baptism is a symbol of life and death, being risen with him after dying to our old self. Verse 39, James and John said, "Oh, we can," they said. Jesus said to them, "Well, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with." In other words, prophetically, he knew many of these disciples would face their own martyrdom and death. But look at this mysterious statement. Verse 40, "But to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared." Jesus is saying to the disciples, it doesn't work the way you think it works. You will suffer for me. But even then, there are certain things that are planned by God that you are not to know, that God has prepared. What does Jesus mean then by sitting at the places of his right or his left? Who are these places prepared for? Are we right back where we began with rule and power? Well, which of all the great Christians in the world will Jesus choose for rule and power at his right and the left when he's in his glory at the end of all things? Jesus, I don't know that you've solved anything here. You with me? Yet the next time Mark uses this phrase, on his right and on his left, Mark tells us of two thieves who are next to him at his crucifixion. And so maybe Jesus' answer offers another upside down twist of status and hopes and ambition. And the disciples have come to him thinking, we want to be in glory at your right and left, Jesus. And Jesus is pointing them again, my glory is in my suffering on the cross and my serving of the world through it. Even the lowest have a place prepared for them. Wow. So we have this final second question. If the disciples are struggling so deeply with their ambitions and their pride and selfishness, what can satisfy us today? How are we going to learn when the pocket's closing in around us and all of a sudden we're selfish to our spouse, or we tell our boss off, or we respond in these old ways? What solution is there? Number 3, we're called to the way of service modeled by Jesus. We are called to the way of service modeled by Jesus. You've heard that point before because Mark wants us to hear it again and again in this book. Mark 10 and verse 41. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant, angry with James and John. Notice, we haven't left the lesson of pride or ambition behind. It's still in this next part. And the disciples are all mad because James and John get to Jesus first with this good question. They're probably mad because the question was totally inappropriate, but they're also mad because they're thinking it deep down inside. What's wrong with you guys asking that, right? James and John are saying, you would ask it too. You're thinking it. Yeah, but I didn't say it. I'm thinking it in here, but I didn't say it, right? Maybe it's out of competition. The disciples are all complicit. Verse 42, Jesus, look at this. What does he do with them when they're struggling? He teaches them. This is why you need the Word of God each and every day, each and every week. You got to come and you got to practice again and again. Jesus called them together. And he said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them. And their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, you disciples, whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant. And again, we repeat this theme in Mark. The lesson hasn't changed. Only the nature of the conflict and the chaos around them has changed. But the lesson is the same. Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave at all. Jesus tells them, you know full well the kinds of abuse and of power that exist in this world. He says disciples don't live in that way. They don't live seeking that. Instead, they live seeking out the fact that greatness comes through lowering oneself to serve. I hope you sense those values week after week coming again, because the book of Mark is designed to be read again and again and again as we cycle through and we learn again and again and again this lesson. We've been working on it in our own hearts, but we see there are some unanswered questions. Why? Why? The disciples still don't know why. So Mark saves maybe the best for the last. And just this short phrase, which I think is maybe one of the climaxes of the whole, all that we have done. And Jesus finally explains why he's going to die. Verse 45, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. We've learned that already. We've learned that glory is not only at the throne, but it is also in serving others. Mark has been holding all of his cards until this point, this small phrase, but it is so weighty and heavy on the whole book. He's been holding it for this moment because in all the weeks to come, we've got to think, why the cross? Why the flogging? Why the death? Why the torture? Why is he going through this for the world? And Mark says, Jesus says, to give his life as a ransom for many. To give his life as a ransom for many. We're moving towards our closing, and I'm reminded of the children's movie Finding Nemo. I'm going to use Finding Nemo to explain this verse. Yes, I am. There's a little clownfish who gets trapped into a fish tank in an aquarium. He's no longer free, and all the other fish have been trapped by this tank for years and years. And the fish realize that this little clownfish, this little guy, is the only way of escape. But to escape, he risks certain death. And so the fish begin to set up in the tank an elaborate ruse to lure little Nemo into his death, or his possible death, in the hopes that they can be free from their enclosure, their prison. There's a powerful little clip, and it's meant to be funny, but for this lesson, for Mark's lesson, I want you to hear the line of the starfish. All these little funny lines, and they're using this ruse to lure the fish into his initiation as a part of the group, and once they initiate him, they're going to send him maybe to his possible death. And the starfish, as they're using this ruse, he yells out this little phrase about another way. It has to be another way. He's only a boy. Take a look.
State your name.
Nemo?
Brother Bloat, proceed.
Nemo, newcomer of orange and white, you have been called forth to the summit of Mount Wanahakalugi to join with us in the fraternal bonds of tankhood.
Huh?
We want you in our club, kid.
Really?
If you are able to swim through the Ring of Fire! Turn on the Ring of Fire. The Ring of Fire! Oh. You said you could do it. The Ring of Fire!
Isn't there another way? He's just a boy!
From this moment on, you will now be known as Sharkbait.
Sharkbait!
There has to be another way. Jesus says, I've come to give my life as a ransom for many, but I want you to know what the world thinks about that. You see, modern secularists would cry out, what kind of God would give up his one and only son to torture and death? There has to be another way, and I don't like this. This doesn't make sense. It's not right. Listen, even modern liberal Christians, the liberalism that has trickled into Christianity all across the Western world, would be embarrassed of this idea that Jesus would suffer and die and suffer a torturous death. And they would say, oh, there has to be another way. There has to be another way. But listen, my friends, when Jesus came, he became incarnate into this world. He came into this trap, into this tank, so to speak, and it was no ruse. There was no manipulation. There was no emotional trickery on the hand of the Father or on the hand of those Romans or those Jewish folks. There was none of that. And the modern complaint rings out, how can a loving Father submit his only Son to the abuse of the cross? You need to know this wasn't just the plan of the Father alone. It was the plan of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. And Jesus, in full awareness of obedient sacrifice and humble service, he willingly purposes himself like a flint to the cross. Fully aware of what he's doing. And what seems such a small phrase, to give his life as a ransom for many, becomes one of the most powerful phrases of all of Mark's gospel, because it's right at this point. Mark is going to turn next week to how should we respond, and then after that, we're going to learn for weeks why the cross and the suffering and the triumphal entry, why it's all happening, so that he could give his life as a ransom for many. What is a ransom? It was slave language. It was a price paid so that slaves could be set free, and Jesus is going to pay the price so that we could get out of this tank of sin and live for him in freedom. And now we turn to our big idea for the day. Our ambitions, our power, our longings for glory. What do we do with this humanity that makes it so hard to learn to be disciples? And our longing for security and status and future. What do we do with it? Mark wants us to know that the struggle with our humanity is solved at the cross. The struggle for our humanity is solved at the cross. And this is the journey of discipleship. It is a long and hard road that we walk. It is a road that leads to glory. But the pathway there is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It is the life and the death to my sinful self and the resurrection of myself because of what he's done. Because of what he's done. We may be slow to learn, but I would challenge you with Mark, who's not afraid of repetition, to keep learning, to keep going. I want you to stand with me and bow your heads and close your eyes. Father, we love you.
Thank you for watching our video. If you liked it, share it with a friend and subscribe to our channel. We go live every Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can also support us by clicking the Give button. This allows us to continue to impact our community as well as help missions across the globe with the love of Jesus Christ. Thanks again for watching.